Anishinaabe Duk, the Mumatuma Indigenous Cause, Gawa Bobby Kanikagan Donjiba, Ajijik Indodame. So I want to say miigwech to Jackie and the Seven Generations program and for asking me to come over and be this native scholar in residence. I know it sounds like it's important and everything and cool, so that's kind of nice. But I'm actually really honored and humbled to be asked to come over. As Jackie was saying, I am a UND grad. Can you all hear me okay in the back there? Yeah, okay. I got my PhD from UND back in 2005. So, geez, it's been a while. It's been a while, man. It's like, wow, time sort of flies by. So I'm really, excited and like I said, honored and humbled to be asked to come back and, share some of the things I guess I've learned over the years, right? And I really appreciate you all coming out today to listen to me talk. I can, I know we're scheduled for 2 hours, and I could probably easily fill that time, and we'll sort of see how it goes. I'll try to make it a little bit interactive if I can when we're talking about some of these things. So I wanted to sort of just kind of give you a little bit of a preface about the title there and so on. This sort of came about based some of my experience. I'm actually really amazed. I'm not even sure what the right sort of adjective is, but over the years, I find it really interesting that when you talk about Native peoples and when you ask non-natives about Native people, it's just amazing on how little they know and how difficult it is for non-native people to talk about Native issues or to even talk about race and things like that there in general. And and again, these are for the most part non-Native people who are our neighbors, right? People who we sort of lived in close proximity with, I mean, for generations, right? But yet they know very sort of little about us. And given it's 2013 and we still sort of have such a difficult time talking about race and talking about sort of history and things that have happened, and whenever the topic comes up about race, the people just have a really difficult time. And it's like this this sort of is a play off of words here, right? About the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about or nobody knows how to sort of deal with the issue. So I sort of came up with this when I was giving a presentation to medical staff, doctors and nurses and faculty and staff over at the hospital over there in Bemidji at Stanford. Well, it wasn't called Stanford back then. It was a couple of years ago. And it was just surprising to me on these folks. They provide services to Native people all the time, but yet they have a really difficult time talking about Indian issues, which doesn't seem like that's the way it should be. So I sort of took it from there, and then sort of been doing a presentation similar to this one here. The one I'm going to do today is really kind of a combination. So I'll talk a little bit about, well, I'm going to talk about all kinds of stuff actually. I'll talk about history, I'll talk about sort of contemporary issues, and then I'll sort of put things in the context around education a little bit. I'm going to talk more about education next week, but I'll sort of talk about it sort of in different contexts, like like health settings and things like that there, about how these sort of things play themselves out when we're trying to deal with the issue of race and culture, and particularly around Native issues and things like that. So that's sort of my little bit of an outline in terms of what I'm planning on talking about here today. So hopefully this clicker will here work. So obviously a lot of this has to do and is related to this idea of cultural competence. Some of us probably have heard this term before or heard this phrase and in various different contexts and things like that there. But one of the things that I've also learned over the years as well too, going way back, I mean, obviously I kind of experienced some of this stuff growing up, but sort of as I navigated my way through education and through the educational system and being a professional now for the several years, I've learned that this idea of cultural competence and diversity training in general is really understood by, well, non-Native people in particular, whites more specifically. A lot of whites and non-Native people assume and believe that this idea of cultural competence and diversity training is only a one-way street. meaning that to be culturally competent or to sort of have diversity training, you're supposed to learn something about the other, right? That's sort of kind of the idea that a lot of people have, is that, you know, I can become culturally competent if I just learn something about those people, right? That's sort of, it's almost sort of how things are taught even, right? I mean, you go to diversity seminars or cultural trainings or things like that there, and, you know, you sort of get a laundry list of you know, little facts and tidbits and, you know, things about the other group of people or whatever, right? And I think that that's only half the picture. I mean, yeah, those things are important, of course. I mean, you know, you need to sort of know what the values and the belief systems and the attitudes and, you know, things like that there about, you know, this group of people that's different from you that you're going to be working with. But that, again, that's only part of it. That's, you know, really, and actually that should be the second part. My sort of premise here, in my sort of thing that I'm trying to say, is that it actually should start with yourself. Any type of cultural competency or diversity training, whatever you want to call it, should really start with yourself, a little bit of a self-exploration. That's where it really should start. And I've learned that over the years in sort of various different ways in terms of how that plays itself out, right? And so what do I mean by that? So here's just a couple of questions I sort of throw up here that everybody should be asking. You know, not only in terms of when you be working with other people, but just in general. I mean, you should know who you are and where you come from. But we sort of have this idea, and we're sort of taught this in a lot of, you know, both implicitly and explicitly, we're sort of taught that if you're not a person of color, right, that's a term we use these days. Race sort of doesn't apply, I guess, is the right sort of phrase I'm thinking about here for whites, right? But I disagree with that. I disagree with that completely, because we're a very racialized society, and you know, and racism is sort of this it's almost like baseball. It's like America's pastime in some ways, you know. So what I mean by that is, and why I say that is because I think that people need to sort of know who they are. If we're talking about diversity training and cultural competency and stuff, you need to know who you are both culturally and racially. Because again, we're a very racialized society, and we still are in 2013. Right? Race still matters, even though we have the black president, two-term black president, and you know, we come up, don't get me wrong, we come a long ways from, you know, from the civil rights movement and all that kind of stuff there or whatever. We're, you know, and we're progressively moving forward, and all those things are good, right? But race still matters in our society. It's one of the first things that we see, and one of the first things that we sort of make assumptions about people and so on when we meet them and so on, right? So you need to know, if you're a non-native person and you're going to be working with native people, or you know, you're going to be working with any sort of culturally diverse group of people, you need to know who you are and where you come from, because those things have shaped how you see the world, and sort of the values that you have, and how you sort of think about relationships between people, and what it means to be black and white and native or Asian or Latino, and all those things. So you need to know sort of who you are and where you come from, where your parents came from, where your grandparents came from, and those kinds of things there. And then how have those things shaped, right, your views? How have you been racialized in society? Because every single person born and raised in the United States is racialized to some extent in our society. And I'll give you all kinds of evidence about this here a little bit later, because some of you are probably thinking, like, really? But yes, we are. Right? And again, I'll give you all kinds of evidence about this here in a little bit. So we're all racialized, and what I mean by that is we learn what it means to be white, what it means to be black, what it means to be Indian or Native, what it means to be Latino, what it means to be Asian, you know, and within the last decade or so, what it means to be Arab or someone who's from the Middle East. We learn, and that's what I mean by being racialized. We sort of learn about what it's supposed to mean to be any one of those racial categories in our society, okay? And, you know, and then sort of okay, so what does that mean to you in terms of your family history, your personal lives, and things like that? Let me sort of just give you an example about what I mean about this, particularly as it applies to non-native people, or I guess white Americans, right? So think, for example, this idea of culture and race, you know, up here in
well, we're on the border here, I guess, Minnesota and North Dakota, but North Dakota and northern Minnesota, you know, we have a lot of whites who are primarily of, you know, either Scandinavian, Norwegian, you know, Swedish, or, you know, German or Polish descent and things like that, right? So, I mean, you know, grandparents and great-grandparents, you know, came, you know, migrated to this area, you know, several generations ago, right? But those things still matter. They should still matter to sort of who you are and where you come from, right? Because it can be a very different thing to be, say, for example, a second or third generation German Catholic. It's very different than, say, a third or fourth generation, you know, Norwegian Protestant, for example, right? I mean, any of those folks in the room here right now? I mean, you know, just think, I mean, so that's culture, right? That's culture. Those two groups of people are sort of different from each other. They have different histories, different backgrounds, they have different beliefs about their relationship with God and the Lord and those kinds of things there, right? But so culturally, that's sort of who they are, and those things have sort of shaped their values and so on, right? But at the same time, obviously, they're both categorized as being white in our society, and that idea of white and whiteness, right, is sort of shaped in a lot of different ways what sort of their position is in society, and of course all of the benefits that sort of have come along with that, right? And I know that, you know, some of you, you know, who have some of those ancestry and that heritage in their background, I mean, you know, you probably remember your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, or you've heard stories about, you know, how even that idea of whiteness was sort of pushed upon those folks, right? Where you were supposed to become an American. You were, you know, where parents and grandparents didn't teach their children, you know, how to speak German or how to speak Norwegian or things like that, right? Because the idea was, okay, you know, we're in America now, you know, but that has had profound effects and impacts in terms of how white people see themselves and who they are and where they come from. So getting in touch with that is actually very, very important, because the other part of that, right, has to do with the idea of, let's see, how do I, you know, what has to do with, again, what it means to be an American, what it means to be white, and, you know, time and time again, I teach a class called Cultural Psychology back at BSU, and every single semester there's always handfuls and handfuls of students who think that they don't have any culture. All right, white students who say, I don't have any culture, you know, and almost sometimes they're almost like jealous, like Indian people have all this culture, you know, and stuff. I'm like, oh, you know, okay, wait a minute, you know, let's just step back from that a second. Who are you? Where'd your parents come from, right? Where did your grandparents come from? That's, you know, I mean, there's culture sort of all around us, right? And sort of all those sort of things, right? So, so asking yourself sort of who you are, and then of course, you know, what comes along with being white is this idea of privilege. There's this thing called white privilege that some people don't believe exists, but it obviously exists. And sort of what goes along with that, right, is that we have sort of assumptions that we make about other groups of people, and you know, and sort of who they are, and sort of how they're all supposed to be alike. So those things are really important. So as I go through sort of talking about all the things that I'm going to be talking about today, again, I wanted to sort of keep in mind that you know, this idea of diversity training or cultural competence, again, is this multi-lane sort of highway, sort of street that exists. So I'll be talking about Native issues, because again, knowing some facts and some things about Native people is obviously important, or any group of people that you're going to be working with. But at the same time, there's always, it's never sort of one way, because we all have a shared history together, right? Native people and non-Native people. We have this sort of shared history that we've all experienced. So what has happened to one group of people has either been sort of, pushed onto that group of people, and of course it's had sort of consequences for both groups of people, right? So it's always sort of a multi-street, two-lane road. It's not sort of just one or the other. But I'm gonna, you know, I've got to go through some sort of history here, sort of lay some facts down and things like that. So one of the first things that I have to answer this question, because I've learned over the years too, like I'll talk about next week, everything you want to know about India is what we're afraid to ask people. I mean, when I was doing, people probably heard the book that Tony Troyer wrote. Anybody heard of that book, Tony Troyer? Anybody know who Tony Troyer is? Anton Troyer. So he wrote this book called Everything You Want to Know About India is What We're Afraid to Ask. Interestingly enough, that title of that book was a speaker series that was first developed and put together by this group called Shared Visions over in Bemidji, Minnesota. And I was actually on a couple of those panels. We were on the stage, doing this. So it was Tony Troyer and Don Gay and a few others, and I was on a couple of those panels. So, but when I would do some of those, it would be interesting. You'd have people come to these, and they would ask this question: who is an Indian? Who's Native? How do I know this? And then what do you want to be called Native Americans, or do you want to be called American Indians, or how are we supposed to talk about that? How are we supposed to talk about these things? So it's important to actually sort of answer it. I mean, it seems like a basic question to a lot of us probably in the room: who's an Indian and who's not an Indian? But those things have changed over the years. So in terms of legality, there actually is no one sort of legal term for Indian. We have a few lawyer or legal folks here. I mean, legally, there's no like one single term for Indian in terms of who's an Indian and who's not an Indian. It depends on who you're asking or what agency or organization is basically answering the question, right? So government agencies and tribes actually have differing criteria. The most common one we often hear about is this idea of blood quantum, right? And most of the government agencies and a lot of tribes sort of adopted this. You have to be at least 1/4 American Indian ancestry, whatever that means, and however you go about, doing that. There's problems with that or whatever and stuff, right? Or other sort of other agencies and organizations sort of use this sort of concept here that a person must have some identifiable Indian ancestry somewhere along the line there or whatever. And then other communities and folks will also sort of say that this is part of it. So these are not sort of meant to be exclusive or exhaustive or things like that. But that the Indian community must recognize this person as being a member of that community as well. So it's not sort of as clear cut and sort of easy to sort of basically to answer this question when you think about it, right? And then of course today, right? I mean, in 2013. A lot of Native people are actually mixed, with all kinds of stuff, right? I mean, take myself, for example. John Gonzalez, no hablo español. I know enough probably just to get me in trouble. But, and I don't look like, your average Indian guy. I don't look like PJ. I'm not as handsome as PJ, so, I don't have that handsome Indian look there, no. But I don't look like your average Ojibwe man, right? I mean, I sort of recognize that, right? And a lot of people, when they meet me, they hear the last name Gonzalez, and they assume that I'm, Latino. And racially, I'm part Latino. I've got some Puerto Rican in me, right? But culturally, I grew up on the res. I'm from White Earth. My mom's a Belfort, and that's where I, grew up. I'm one of those AIM babies. Kind of. I was born before that. Right? So a lot of us are mixed, right? But sort of how we identify. That's the other interesting thing actually about race and culture is that we have sort of this peculiar thing in the United States. Maybe this is true around the world, where we actually identify people, and we love to identify people rather than let people self-identify. Right? We love to sort of identify someone and put them in a category because, there's a cognitive thing, I'm a psychologist, so there's a cognitive reason for that because it helps us sort of function and go about our world, but obviously it gets us in trouble, right? When we make assumptions about people based on how they look and that kind of stuff there, right? So, so sort of, that's something to sort of keep in mind when we're talking about some of these Native issues. Now, obviously related to that as well, too, is this concept of sort of the Native cultural context and what that means and who's supposed to define that, and so on, right? So, asking this question is important. What is the cultural context? What is this Native cultural context? And particularly, what it is today? I don't stand here in front of everybody and sort of claim to know exactly what this is for all Indian people. That's sort of problematic in and of itself. I just, I know what it is for me, right? I'm just one Indian guy, right? Who has my experiences and sort of have been taught the values and belief systems and, and engage in cultural practices. So I know what it means for me, so I don't claim to be an expert in all things Indian. And it's really sort of hard to sort of define that, right? But what I can say pretty confidently is that whatever Native culture is today, because Native culture is a lot of different things today in the 21st century, right? But whatever it is today, it's been shaped by social, historical, and political factors. Whatever Native culture is today, in the United States, Canada, around the world, whatever indigenous culture, I guess, for that matter, is today, it's been shaped by this social, political history. Things that have happened in the past that influenced how Native people do things today and how we sort of see our relationship with the world and other people in the world and that kind of thing there, right? So here's a saying that I like to talk about, because that's my dad there, actually. That's my stepfather there. He's my dad. He's who raised me. Some of you might know that name, but he used to say this all the time. Growing up, I used to hear him say this all the time. Half the time I didn't listen to him, and I wish I would have listened to him a little bit more. But later, when I got a little bit older, I kind of realized, this little man doesn't know what he's talking about sometimes. Probably a lot of times. So he used to say this, that Indian life is tough. And I'm sure a lot of you probably heard your uncles and aunties and grandpas and grandmas sort of say something very, very similar to this, right? I mean, Indian life is tough, right? It's hard to be Indian. He used to tell me this all the time. He used to say these things. But then he would also, sometime within that same discussion or things that he was talking about, but he was still proud to be born in India. He was happy that he was in India, even though Indian life was tough and it was hard. Right? My dad was born in 1921, and he was a victim of the boarding school era. They came got him when he was like 6 or 7 and sent him down to Pipestone, Minnesota. There was a mission boarding school down there in Pipestone, so that's where he was sent. So so his life was hard. I mean, it was a lot harder than my life. That's for sure, right? But when we look at this phrase, and this thing that my dad used to say all the time, there's actually stories, lots and lots of stories, just within that little phrase right there about Indian life being tough, but at the same time being happy that he was born Indian, right? There's stories obviously about oppression that he experienced. There's stories in there about, trauma, generational trauma or historical trauma, whatever phrase you like, whatever your flavor is, right? People use it interchangeably or whatever, right? But at the same time, there's also stories in there about strength, about pride, about resilience, that Native people have, right? Because this is a shared story that, even though this comes from my dad, but, his experience is very, very similar to lots and lots of Native people, right? And there's stories embedded in sort of these phrases, these things that we say, right? So, and if we're going to be talking about Indian people, unfortunately, we cannot not talk about these things, right? In terms of historical trauma and oppression, and sort of how these things have sort of played themselves out. A lot of people argue, and I think in a lot of ways legitimately, sort of make this argument that a lot of the issues that Native people experience today has to do with historical trauma and oppression, right? And so it has a very, very important sort of historical context to it, because again, a lot of the behavioral health issues that we have in Indian country, and obviously other things in terms of economic issues and education and all these, for the most part, can be through research sort of linked, related to the trauma and the oppression that we've experienced as Native people, right? But I also want to say this, because I think this is really important, because let me sort of back up for a second. So every single Native person alive today has probably been affected by historical trauma in some way, and continues to be affected by historical trauma in some ways. But at the same time, just because every single Indian alive today has been affected by historical trauma doesn't automatically mean that that person is going to have health problems. Right? Does that make sense? So even though every single Indian alive today has been affected by historical trauma, has been affected by oppression, continues to be oppressed in some ways, that doesn't automatically translate into that person having issues, behavioral health issues, mental health issues, health problems in general, and all those kinds of things, right? So what I mean by that, obviously, is that there's lots and lots of, strong, healthy Native people in this world, and that speaks to sort of the resilience that Native people also have, and so on, right? So, but it's important to sort of keep those sort of things in mind, sort of talk about that. But like I was saying, I think that this idea of historical trauma and oppression is sort of one of those core factors that are influencing Native health. And when I talk about Native health, I don't just sort of mean one aspect of that. I'm talking about sort of the mental, the physical, and the spiritual, sort of all of those sort of things, sort of mean health and wellness and so on, right? So I have a good friend and colleague who Eduardo Duran sort of talks about it sort of in this language here, that we have sore wounds or we have wounded spirits. But in a lot of ways, you can actually link these other physical health problems like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and so on, can be sort of linked to oppression and historical trauma that Native people have experienced and continue to experience. There's another interesting unfortunate consequence that sort of goes along with that for Indigenous people actually all over the world, this idea of internalized oppression in terms of how that sort of shapes our views about ourselves and how we see ourselves, right? And I don't want to, that's a whole other lecture. I don't want to actually get into that whole internalized oppression stuff or whatever, right? So it's obviously has some, contemporary impacts when we think about this, right? And then, I also want to sort of stress this, that I think that oppression still exists today. It's actually all around us. And any folks here at UND probably continue to experience it every single day when you walk around campus. And discrimination still exists, and it exists in a lot of different ways. The overt stuff is still out there, although it's not sort of as socially acceptable today to be overtly discriminatory or racist, towards people. A lot of times it happens very covertly, which I'm going to use this term microaggressions, which I'll sort of talk a little bit about later. So let me sort of put oppression sort of in a historical context, and because it's really, really important in terms of where we are today and the things that we're experiencing today. We have to sort of always think about this sort of historical context. So we can't deny our past. I mean, we just can't, right? I mean, if anybody denied any of these things happen, they're living in a different reality than well, at least than I am. But I think that, these things have happened, so we can't deny them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these, because each one of these are actually very, very important, even though a lot of these, or some of these things, not a lot of these, but some of these things are not Native specific. They obviously sort of, still play a sort of important role in terms of how we interact with each other sort of in modern times, right? So, so these things have happened, right? Slavery, colonization, stolen lands, which kind of goes along with colonization, this idea of manifest destiny, and all these various government policies and practices sort of shape the way that we interact with each other. This is the interesting thing that I've learned over the years, is that these things are sort of these macro level kinds of things that have occurred, these policies, these different sort of very large sort of macro level things, but they influence how we interact on a very, very micro interpersonal level. And I'll sort of get you to that point here in a second, if that makes any sense. So I want to talk a little bit about these. So I like to use imagery because it's just so powerful. It just has a huge sort of ability to sort of drive messages home. So these are these are two very big sort of beginnings of our society and parts of our history. The idea of slavery, that occurred, and how much trauma and how much pain that has caused, and it's still with us today. 2013, even though we have a black president, slavery continues to impact not only black people, but sort of just everybody in our society. In terms of, this is why we're so racialized still in 2013, because slavery played such a huge role in terms of what the meaning of race is in American society. Okay? And then this idea of colonization, right? I mean, this idea of colonization has sort of different meanings depending on if you're a colonizer or a colonized, right? But the image that, for the most part, the image that most white Americans have about colonization is a positive one, because it's led to vast amounts of wealth and resources and so on around the world, right? And these are often the images that sort of we see, right, of a colonizer, coming in, riding a big white horse, and it's sort of seen as a very, very positive thing. And you've got, gold and treasures and all that. I mean, this also speaks to this idea. This is a game. A game has been created for young people to play, where you can go around the world and colonize and gain rewards and points and treasures at the expense of other people. So this speaks a lot. I mean, this image right here speaks a lot about how American society sees colonization as a good thing. But of course, if you're the colonized group, like Native people are in the United States, it's not the same meaning for us. And for indigenous people around the world, it doesn't have that sort of same meaning, right? And this is, again, these things, when we see these images like this, it has, very, very subtle influences on how we interact with each other interpersonally, at an interpersonal level, at a micro level. And a lot of times it's sort of even unconscious, we're even sort of unaware of how our history has shaped our views today, shaped our worldview today in particular, right? And then, the idea of manifest destiny, some people actually probably never even heard of this term before. But manifest destiny, of course, right, was this ideology that was espoused and it was promoted and it was sort of used as justification for Europeans to basically colonize and claim North America, Turtle Island, as theirs. Right? I mean, in this image here, this is a really, really interesting image in terms of how this sort of vision, again, the power of images is very, very influential in terms of how it sort of shapes how we see things, right? But can anybody sort of see sort of what the meaning of this image right here and what this is sort of saying without words? What is this saying? What is this image sort of saying about westward expansion, for example? Yes?
The Creator, God, heavenly powers wanted in the sake of progress to have this happen.
Right. And the idea, that's exactly sort of what it's saying. That's the actual sort of definition, so to speak, of manifest destiny, right? So, and then this sort of image sort of shows you that, right? It was sort of destined, by God, and that the white race, would have this land, and God sort of wanted us to have these lands. And then imagery here, you sort of see that it's sort of nice, light, sunshine over here, and you see, Western Europeans sort of moving, across the land, and over here they're sort of ridding, North America of darkness and evil and all those sort of things that were, native or indigenous and so on. And that's what this sort of image is sort of saying, right? And again, these sort of things, they influence how we see the world. I'm not going to read through all this. Some of you probably seen this before, heard this before, but I mean, this idea of manifest destiny, right? I mean, this is, obviously one of our former presidents, sort of said something sort of to that, sort of justifying it, sort of saying, okay, this was okay for us to do this here and also around the world. It was okay for the whites, for Europeans to take these lands because these, we were meant to have these lands, and we were meant to sort of, crush the indigenous people around the world, and it was righteously for us to do this and to claim, to take these, even though it's horrible. These are horrible things that we are doing and that we've done to indigenous people. That's okay because God sort of wants us to have these lands. That's the way it's sort of to be, right? So the, when you nowadays when we look at this, it's like, holy cow, but this is what the mindset was in those times. And again, this is our history. And this still shapes how people sort of see those relationships between racial and cultural groups today, right? We have government, lots of other specific government policies. The Indian Wars in particular had to do with extermination. There was other policies that followed from them. The idea of relocation, obviously the most famous one, right, were the Trail of Tears, although there was actually more than one trail. Some people only assume that there was one trail, but there was actually multiple trails of tears, where you had the eastern, southeastern tribes and nations were relocated, right, and hundreds, if not thousands, hundreds of thousands of those native people died, and on the trail itself. And then of course, after they got there, this is a very sort of, if you know your geography at all, right? Oklahoma is very, very different from southeastern United States, right? So, just imagine this for a second, for a minute here, that, you're taken from your homelands, you're forced. And even before that, right? You thought you were doing everything right? You thought you were doing, everything that you could possibly do to sort of live in peace with, the European settlers, right? You adopted, different various ways. Some of you became Christians and, adopted, Christianity, and they became, farmers and homesteaders and things like that. So they were doing everything that they thought that they were supposed to do to sort of live in peace and, with the newcomers or whatever. And then all of a sudden, Andrew Jackson comes along and sort of says, no, we want these lands for the common white man, so that they can have some land and acquire some wealth and all that. And then, your whole tribe is picked up and forced to this very, very strange, different place. That can, that's just, I can't even imagine that myself, for thinking about that. Even a native person myself, in terms of how detrimental, how devastating that would be to who you are and your identity and all that stuff, right? And of course, there's been consequences ever since then as a result of that sort of policy, right? So this happened, but this was happening all over the country, right? All over North America, for that matter, right? This was happening where people were being relocated to different places. Right here in White Earth Indian Reservation, this was not originally White Earth. I'm from White Earth, so White Earth was not originally sort of a place where my ancestors lived, right? My mom, on my mom's side, my grandmother is actually from Red Cliff, from that area over there, which is in Wisconsin, over the Madeline Island over there. So she was relocated when she was a child to White Earth, because White Earth was supposed to meant to sort of get rid of all the other reservations in there. So there's supposed to be, put all these Indians over here and this whatever, right? So, and my dad, or my mom, or my grandpa, some of our family comes from Canada, right? So so this stuff was happening all over the place for relocation. Putting people on different lands that they normally necessarily didn't sort of grow up on. Right? And then of course we have assimilation. This is probably one of the most powerful images it sort of represents that. There's others. I could show you a whole slideshow of different images about, but this is one of the most famous ones. This guy's name was Tom Torino, right? He was a Navajo Dene man. And you sort of see the before and after image, in terms of what was supposed to happen when we take all these children and put them in this boarding school and, save the Indian, right? Kill the man, kind of thing. Right? So those things have happened, right? And then there's other policies and practices of the government that obviously were very, very oppressive. Again, that have dual meanings, right? Depending on if you're white or if you're not white, if you're native or if you're non-native, right? The idea of westward expansion. This again is sort of seen as a positive thing for whites in general. This is the history that at least you're taught. I was taught this in school growing up. The westward expansion was this glorious thing that allowed us to have all this wealth and all this land in our nation, right? But you don't hear about, obviously, well, at least I didn't hear about it when I was going to school and walking high school over in Minnesota. about sort of the consequences and, you know, how Native people were affected. I was hearing about it when I went home from my family, but now when I was in school, right, and how lands were basically taken and how wars were created falsely. You know, this is just how we create wars for our own self-interest. You know, this is not something new or old. I mean, it's still happening today, right? And again, you have the image here, right, of, you know, these settlers sort of moving through this land and encountering these savages and all that. But we have all this beautiful, pristine land that's sort of meant to be ours, all right? That's a policy. This is non-natives here, obviously specific, but I mean, you know, the suffrage movement, I mean, this is oppression. I mean, this is oppression. Less than 100 years ago, this happened, and how it's had profound effects on the relationship between men and women in our society, and how women even today continue to be oppressed in our society. And if you're a brown or a black woman, you experience twice as much oppression, you know, that goes along with that, right? I mean, there was a time, right? I mean, I don't know if you guys can read this here or not, right? But women's suffrage would double the irresponsible vote, is what they claimed and what they said, right? That, you know, it's a menace to the home, to men's employment, and to all business if we let these women vote, right? They didn't win the right to vote until, what was it, 1920, right? That was wrong. Right? So that was, you know, again, you know, we have a history of oppression, of all kinds of oppression in our society, and it's had tremendous influences on where we are today and how, you know, how it influences sort of the discourse and the way that we sort of see things. And again, my argument is that it's very, very subtle. Almost unconsciously, it influences how we see our relationships with people today. You know, I'm actually really amazed. Actually, there's a lot of young people today, a lot of my students don't even know that there was a law that existed, that you had to be white to be an American. This was law. This was the law of the land for actually almost all of our history. If you think about it, it wasn't until like the 1920s, 1930s that we got rid of this law. In 1790, the Citizen and Naturalization Act said that only free white person may become a citizen. And of course, after emancipation, you know, that black folks could be white or could be Americans. But even then, you know, we had you know, the famous Dred Scott case that basically, even though they're a citizen, they don't have any rights. They don't have the same rights. Even a free black person doesn't have the same rights as a white person does, right? And this has had humongous, tremendous effects on how we see race in our society. These two examples here, I just have to sort of quickly sort of talk about this. This guy here, his name was Takao Ozawa. He was Japanese. He wasn't an American because he couldn't become an American. But he did this interesting thing. He actually tried to petition. He went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he said, you know what, race shouldn't matter, and whether or not you're going to be an American or not, because you know, the color of your skin shouldn't matter if you can be an American. What should matter is what your values are, what your beliefs are, and how you live your life. So he raised this, he became a Christian, he converted to Christianity, he had a business, you know, he spoke English, and he taught all his children English. You know, he basically had all white friends and things like that. So he was, you know, trying to become American because he wanted to become American. So he went all the way to the Supreme Court to sort of argue this case. And then the Supreme Court, in let me give you a year context here. In 1922, he did this. In 1922, he petitioned for citizenship, but the Supreme Court said, well, according to science, you're not white, so you can't be an American. Because science tells us that you're Asian, you're Asiatic, you're Mongolian. You cannot be white, and you're not white, so you can't be an American. And this had humongous, tremendous negative consequences on the Asian American, well, I guess they weren't Americans, but the Asian population, because they had all this land. A lot of them were here for 2, 3, 4 generations. They were farmers. They were productive members of society. And guess what happened? They came in and they seized our land. They couldn't own land because they weren't Americans. They lost everything that they had. And of course, and after World War II, they all went to internment camps and all that, right? So I mean, it had and then this guy here, His name is Bhagat Singh Thind. He was actually a World War I veteran. He's Indian of Indian ancestry, right? He actually petitioned the court just a couple of years later. 1 year later, 2 years later, he petitioned the court and said, you know, according to science, Indians are white. According to the best science of the day, the science back then said, you know, that Indians were white, that they had sort of an ancestry that could be linked to people in Europe. That's what the science basically said, right? But the Supreme Court said, well, yeah, you know, maybe science says that, you know, somewhere back in antiquity, we have a similar ancestry and we share the same ancestor or whatever, but everybody knows what white is and you are not white. So whiteness is what the common white man says it is. So they basically contradicted their own logic that they used a year before about what it meant to be white and using science and all that, and they sort of turned around and said, well, no, that's not what it means. Sorry. So, and of course, this, you know, there were lots of Indian American, you know, real Indians, I like to say, in India. They were here in the United States, the business owners and all that and so on. So they lost all their rights and possessions to sort of go along with that. It wasn't until the 1930s when this law, this white by law, American, to be American, you had to be white, was sort of taken and sort of struck down and so on, right? So again, that would have huge impacts. And of course, you know, we know about these policies here, these government policies, Jim Crow laws, segregation, the intern camps that occurred as a result of that. And again, how it sort of shaped. And these are not too long ago. In relative terms, these things have not happened that long ago. Right? Segregation, so on. There's another, this one here is actually one that a lot of people don't know about, but it's had huge effects on the disparities that exist, particularly economic disparities that exist in our society. This idea of redlining. How many people here have heard of redlining before? Sort of know about redlining, right? I mean, this interesting policy in conjunction with sort of private practices and sort of, you know, private business practices that sort of played itself out, which basically created the middle class as we know it today, was a result of this redlining policy and home lending. So there was basically what this was. It was sort of written into sort of government, you know, lending policies and practices that sort of how we got sort of, you know, the 30-year mortgage that we have today, right? But within there, the lenders and things like that there, they developed sort of this color coding maps indicating, you know, the level of security of different real estate within different cities, all the major metropolitan areas around the country, right? And basically, red neighborhoods were considered high risk and were not qualified for loans, home loans, business loans, and things like that there. And then when you went up to blue and green neighborhoods were the ones that were, you know, considered to be, you know, low level of risk and, you know, qualifying. But of course, these were segregated by race, right? So blue and green neighborhoods were predominantly white. And red and yellow, well, red were predominantly people of color, either black or Latino and that kind of thing there. And then of course yellow were mixed and so on and so forth, or whatever, right? But the more mixed the neighborhood, or the more brown or black the neighborhood was, the higher the risk was. And there was a period between 1934 and 1962 where $120 billion in government subsidized loans were granted. And less than 2% of that went to black and brown people. This created the middle class as we know it today, and that's how people, how our parents and our grandparents acquired their wealth for the most part. In terms of our generation, right? It was your home was your nest egg, and it acquired equity over the years and so on and so forth, and then of course the longer you were in that housing market, the more likely you were able to sort of take that wealth and diversify that wealth, so that when economic tough times hit, you were less likely to be hurt by that economic difficulty. Like the last one we had in 2008 here, right? The downturn of the economy was primarily a housing bubble that crashed, that sort of led to the crashing of the economy and so on and so forth, right? So So black and brown people were actually sort of just relatively newcomers, or were just getting into that housing market. So black and brown people were actually even more hurt by the economic downturn as a result of, not being in that market long enough, not being able to acquire wealth over the generations, over the years, and of course, unemployment, things. I mean, that's not one of the story, right? Or, black and brown people were the first people to lose their jobs in the economic downturn. Compared to, you talk about, 7, 8, 9, 10% unemployment in the population in general. I mean, it's twice that, 3 times that, almost 90% on some Indian reservations, right? Black population, in terms of their unemployment, has always been in the teens, if not double digits, around the 20s and so on, 20% and so on, right? So, so these things, again, have had sort of long-lasting effects. And this redlining, this whole, economic stuff is relatively new. I mean, it's, within my generation of sort of having, in the past. So again, we can't deny the past. Yes, that was then, but what about now, right? And my argument here is that oppression still exists today. What about today? Oppression exists. It's actually really, really hidden in a lot of ways in our institutions, in our different structures, our different systems that we have. Again, I'm a psychologist, so I talk a lot about it in terms of health systems and professions and things like that. For my profession in general, we primarily use this Western model of mental health, or of health in general. It's basically based on the medical model, right? But that's, for Indigenous people, that's a very, very foreign system. It's a sort of foreign ideology. And sort of think about this for a second, right? I've had conversations with Eduardo Duran about this, and he's written about this before as well too. But and we wrote an article together, and we sort of talked about this, the idea that, first we were oppressed by, the Europeans coming and taking our land, and then, it created all these problems with the oppression and the genocide and the trauma that occurred because of that. And then now we've got, white Western European, mental health professionals coming in and trying to treat us from the same foreign ideology that created all the problems in the first place. Does that make sense? Right? We use sort of this Western language, psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, or existential, or, all these sort of, Western theories about, pathology and psychopathology and what it means to be, a human being and all those. And so we use, we're just continuing the oppression when we do that. We're continuing to oppress Native people when we use the same foreign ideology that oppressed us 100 years ago. So we continue it, right? And then, of course, when we have our degrees, I have to watch this myself. I acknowledge this, since I become a PhD, what comes along with that is privilege. And when we have privilege, that's the interesting thing about privilege. When you have privilege, a lot of times you try to deny it. And it blinds us. It blinds sort of how we see things, how we sort of see the world, and our awareness of these sort of different things that sort of go on and sort of take place. And we think that we know so many things now. When I say this to other psychologists, they often don't want to hear this, but we continue to oppress people, and we don't even realize it, that we're doing this, right? So there's other ways. We have these health disparities. I'm actually just going to put all these up here, sort of talk quickly through this, right? But this is how oppression continues to happen today in health, in particular, right? These are incredible numbers when you think about this for a second, right? Natives, a lot of people know this already, but natives have the highest rate of diabetes almost around the world, right? We have the highest rates of diabetes. Some communities are over 50%, right? Natives die from preventable diseases and conditions at exceptionally higher rates than the general population, right? We're like 500% higher for tuberculosis, 177% higher we're dying from diabetes, from suicide, alcoholism, right? These are interesting. And this sort of shows you how oppression sort of plays itself out today in terms of the mistreatment that we receive. Native elderly diabetes death rate is almost double than their white counterparts. Even when you equalize across education and and income and things like that, right? Cancer rates are actually increasing for Native people and Latinos, but at the same time they're decreasing for whites. What's going on there? Why is that? Why are Native and Latino people increasing in terms of their cancer rates, but it's going down for whites? Right? The infant mortality rates, you know, African Americans have the highest actually in the world. They have the highest infant mortality rates. And then the natives are actually as well, they're 45% more likely than whites are. And a lot of it sort of has to do with sort of this, these sort of things here too, where minorities receive less desirable surgical procedures at significantly higher rates than whites do. So these are sort of some of the ways that sort of the oppression sort of plays itself out today. A lot of this data is within the last 5 years. This data comes from. This is not 100 years ago. This is not 50 years ago. These things are happening today, where we're experiencing these disparities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think some of those things are happening today. Criminal justice disparities. I know we have some legal folks in this, some of this, you know. In Minnesota, Native youth are only about 4% of the Minnesota population, but yet they're almost half of the youth in juvenile detention centers or residential treatment centers. What's up with that? That should not be the way it should be. Right? We make up less than 5% of the population, Native youth do, but we're almost half of the population that's incarcerated in Minnesota. In North Dakota, Native people are about 6% of the overall population, but yet they're almost 20% of all the inmates incarcerated in North Dakota. That disparity should not be like that. That should not be the way it is. It should be proportionate, right? We should be about 6% of the people incarcerated in North Dakota. In South Dakota, it's similar. They're about 10% of the population, Native people are in South Dakota, but yet they're about 21% of all inmates incarcerated in South Dakota. In Polk County, just across the river here, the Latino population is only about 5-6% of the population in Polk County, but yet they're 21% of the inmates in the Northwest Regional Correctional Facility Center over there in Crookston. Again, disproportionate. That shouldn't be like that, right? In Beltrami County, where I live, Native people make up about almost 20% of the population for Beltrami County, right? But yet, we're 90+% of all inmates in Beltrami County right now are Indian people. What's going on? Why is that? We're not more likely to be criminals, right? Some people actually probably believe that, but that's not true, right? We're not more likely. We're not more sort of, this is what they said 100, 200 years ago. It's trying to say the same things today. There's a system, it's systematic across from the cop on the street all the way up to the judge. There's these perceptions that people have. There's sort of these very sort of unconscious, sort of minute, sort of, interpersonal, micro sort of ways that we sort of interact with each other, where, people who are in power make assumptions, have beliefs that end up sort of resulting in this huge disparity. All of these disparities that exist right here, where we have more people of color incarcerated than proportion to the population. That's a whole other lecture. We could go into all kinds of, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of this as well. I just love this little caption here. This is one of Shrimna Lexi's little drawings here about how oppression occurs in education. There's a whole bunch we could talk about here, but this one here is just striking to me. Minnesota, we're at the bottom of the list when it comes to graduating Indian kids from high school. We're at the bottom of the list. There's only 50 states, people. Minnesota's at the bottom when it comes to graduating Native kids from high school. And we have one of the largest Native populations in the country. We're like fourth or fifth, somewhere around there, behind Arizona, New Mexico, South Dakota, and California, right? So we have one of the largest Native populations, but yet we rank last when it comes to graduating kids from high school. That's just pitiful. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And there's lots of reasons why this happens. And next week, when I talk about this sort of in an educational context, I'll sort of give some reasons why this. But they have to do. I think, well, there's all kinds. This is only sort of one little part of it. There's obviously other reasons, but I think that curriculum issues plays a huge role in that, in terms of how we teach Native kids in school, and what we're teaching Native kids in school. Things about Columbus. I've got 3 boys, 20-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 6-year-old. And this is dated 10/14/13. My 6-year-old in 1st grade. When my first like this, when he's taught like this in school, this is upsetting. People, whites don't see this as oppressive. They see Columbus as, this savior, this hero, this, great explorer and discoverer, and so on, right? But when Indian kids are taught things like this, what does that tell us about the value of us and our people?
Well, I think it's any kids that are taught that.
Well,
that's an accurate history.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, that too, right? Right. So when we're taught things like this, and we have to, and I talk to my teachers every year I go to school, but I have to. Every year when I get a new teacher, I have to go to school and sort of talk about these things. And so, look. So it's things like that. Thanksgiving's coming up here, of course, you know what's going to happen there, right? And then how we teach U.S. history, right? The idea of Christianity, and so on. I mean, Minnesota actually, we're at the bottom of the list, not only for Native people, but for almost every ethnic minority. We rank 49th for blacks, 50th for Latinos, 49th for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We're just not, I mean, there's something going on here, right? Sort of systemically, in terms of why we have this disparity, right? Economic disparities is another one that continues to sort of oppress Native people in terms of income levels, unemployment rates, and occupations. I got some data here that I'm just going to show you real quick. This is specifically to Bemidji area here, but I think this is probably true for lots of different places around the country where we have Native populations or whatever, right? So this is specifically, again, for American Indians is in red, and non-Hispanic whites is in blue. This is percent of the population in Beltrami County, or the Bemidji area, actually, which encompasses part of Cass County and Hubbard County and Clearwater County as well, too. 86.4% of the Native population lives below poverty in the Beltrami area, where only 24% of the white population is below poverty. When we break it down by age, we obviously see that, I mean, it's true for all age categories, basically, right? Except for people 65 and older, which is interesting. They have 0 here. I don't know how that can actually be, but well, there's what's that? Right. That's part of explaining this data that Indian people, we don't live that long because we have all these health disparities, right? And we're dying before most of us get there or whatever, right? So across all age categories, the median income, again, for natives, it's $9,000 a year, or for the non-native population, it's $53,257. The median income. This sort of tells an interesting story right here, in terms of how that ends up playing itself out, but then also how oppression ends up playing itself out. So these are occupation types. And you all probably can't see this right here, but right here, this one here is management, professional, and related occupations, service occupations, sales and office occupations, the natural resources like construction, maintenance occupations, and then production like transportation, material moving occupations, and things like that, right? So when you look at this, you sort of see what's happening here, right? And how this affects economics, how this affects income levels, and how this affects, your ability to for upward mobility and so on. Because most of the white people are the ones who are in management, in professional related types of positions. So they're the ones who have the power for promotions, for hiring, and for all that stuff, right? And then Native people disproportionately make up the servant occupations. These are primarily, for Beltrami County, it's primarily casino related, right? We're going to casino, basically, because we have 3 of them over there in then sales and office as well too, we sort of see that disparity there. And then again, we sort of see where, these are sort of lower paying, lower level types of positions and jobs. So, that sort of speaks to sort of how those things sort of continue to play themselves out in our everyday lives today, right? Homeowner, renter, this goes back to the redlining policies that were sort of in place. This is owner occupied, and of course it's sort of flip-flop, right? We're renter occupied. I mean, Native people are primarily renting in the Beltrami County area, and when you rent, you don't acquire any equity and any wealth. Sort of goes into the property that you own and things like that. Right? So how does this data relate to attitudes? All of that stuff I'm talking about in terms of those disparities, the economic, educational, criminal justice, the health disparities, and so on. Interestingly, this group that I used to belong to, called Shared Vision, did a study of these attitudes and perceptions in Bemidji not too long ago. And there's some interesting stories that kind of go along with this. So they asked a bunch of different questions. I'm only going to give you a few of them here for time constraints here. So they asked them, respondents' views on whether the Bemidji area is welcoming to people of all races. So they had whites, they had Native people living in the Bemidji area, and they had Native people living on the reservations, were sort of the three different groups, right? And obviously, if you look at this for a second, you sort of see that, holy cow, there's this huge disparity in terms of how we see race relations in our community. Where whites, you have 73% of whites believe that the Bemidji area is welcoming, right? That's what this is, 64 plus 9, right? Which translates to strongly agree or agree, right? But at the same time, 73% of natives in Bemidji and 88% of natives on the reservation believe it is not welcoming. It's the complete opposite, right? That's what makes up these two right here, these two shades right here, right? So we have very, very, very different perceptions in terms of how welcoming the Bemidji area is. And I bet you, my 1 year salary did the same thing would hold true for Grand Forks, right? Something very, very similar to this would sort of play itself out. Respondents' ratings of race relations in the community, again, very, very similar, right? Where you have, well, actually, this one is a little bit sort of, I don't know if it's balanced or not, but 73% of whites think Bemidji is welcoming, 66% think race relations is poor to fair. In contrast, 89% of those in Bemidji and 95% think that they're actually poor to fair as well. So it's sort of, again, similar to the residents' views on whether leaders work well together to address the diversity issues. Again, we sort of see a contrast here, right, where we have a bunch of whites seeing that they do work together well, but natives don't see that at all, right? It's the opposite. I mean, they're saying, well, no, you're not working. And that's important because when you think about how to change things in the future, leadership is a critical factor. And leadership can obviously mean lots of different things, right? It can mean people who are like, in the government, who work, who are mayors and, council members and, county commissioners and things like that. But it also can mean people who are like in educational systems and business leadership and stuff like that in terms of how we go about hiring more Native people and stuff like that. So those people make a big factor, right? Residents' views on whether generations of discrimination make it harder for minority groups to achieve their goals. And this is strongly related to what I was just talking about in terms of our history of oppression, right? Look at this for a second here, where you see that whites, about 65% of whites agree it does. Significantly more of the natives in Bemidji believe so, and then the people on the reservation believe so as well too, right? So what this means really so whites are saying that, generations of discrimination make it harder for minority groups to achieve their goals. That's a good number. 60% of people sort of believe that that's true. White people believe that's true. Obviously, more Native people believe that that's true. But yet, when you think about this for a second, in terms of what does this mean for current interactions, right? What this means, at least the way that I interpret this, is that when a Native person can't get a job, or can't get a promotion, or is having a difficult time making it through the education system, trying to graduate from high school, and so on, When that happens to us, we're more likely to link that to the past. But when whites sort of see that happening to Native people, yeah, there's a bunch of them who sort of think it, it has something to do with it, but it's only sort of seen as sort of in the contemporary context. And it's sort of seen in the contemporary context in the sense that, okay, hey, wait a minute, we elected a black president. Anybody should be able to, this has always been sort of a myth of sort of meritocracy that sort of exists in our society in general. Is that anybody should be able to make it in our society. Look, for crying out loud, we've got a black president. So why can't this Indian guy get a job? Why can't this Indian woman graduate from college? It must be, then we sort of get into this whole, blame the victim kind of thing, kind of goes along with that, right? But for us, when that happens to us, it's linked to everything that happened in the past. But for non-natives, they don't make that sort of same linkage. They sort of assume that it's sort of a contemporary issue and that there must be something going on in terms of why, this is not, why this person is not able to make it, so to speak, right? All right, let me, I wanted to get onto a little bit of positive stuff. So let me just sort of, they asked us some other questions here in terms of the highest frequency of discrimination reported by respondents. Native people living on the reservation sort of say, it's happening, 40% of them say, on a daily basis, on a regular basis, it's happening to me. I'm being discriminated against. The natives in Bemidji sort of say a little bit less. When you ask them where it's occurring, where is this discrimination occurring to you? Retail shopping. When you go to Walmart, you're being followed around the store. Every single time you go to the checkout and you try to leave, the person checks your receipt. Those kinds of things there. Law enforcement, community in general. When you're going out to restaurants and theaters or other entertainment, in the court system, obviously employment, even in hunting and fishing rights, this is a big issue here for us over there in Minnesota or whatever. And then sort of down the line, right? So these are sort of the primary areas we're sort of talking about. So some of you are probably asking, okay, so what's going on here? What's happening here? Why or how are these disparities and perceptions maintained in the 21st century? Right, the 2013, for crying out loud, how come we still have all these disparities happening? What's going on here? So I've already been talking about this, this idea that oppression sort of it's institutionalized in the way it's sort of, the way that the standard or sort of the norm way that we sort of interact with each other, right? And then privilege sort of goes along with that, and microaggressions, this idea that how race and what it means to be black, white, Native, Latino, Asian is sort of weaved into the fabric of American society. The meaning behind race is weaved into sort of the discourse, how we talk about it, and how we don't talk about it. In very, very subtle ways, it's weaved into sort of the norm. We have this idea called the white standard, where everything is compared to whiteness and where white is considered normal. And what's not white is considered sort of abnormal, and how that sort of plays itself out. Right? It's sort of the way, again, when I say discourse, I say with a capital D here, in terms of how we talk, the language that we use, the images that we use, the sort of the way that we sort of are educated, quote unquote, not in school, but in society, about the meaning of race and everything that goes along with that. And I talk about it nowadays primarily in terms of microaggressions. Yeah, I talk about all these macro level sort of things, but really that has a direct influence in how we interact with each other on a very interpersonal level. So microaggressions, you're probably asking, okay, what the heck is that? My good friend Anthony Staley has a nice little bit. He says it's a $10 research word we've come up with to talk about discrimination. It's this fancy word that we've come up with. It's something that's it's been around for a long time. It's basically discrimination, right? So this is how Darrell Stewart defines it. Again, these are commonly occurring, sometimes daily indignities, slights, or insults. They're both intentional. I think actually most of the time they're actually unintentional. But they send a message of derogatory or negative status to the victim, right? Often the microaggressor, the person engaging in microaggressions or committing microaggressions, is really unaware. I mean, most of the time, I believe that they are unaware. These are unconscious. We're not even realizing that we're doing it half the time. Most of the time, actually. You know, that such an act has been committed, and when you call attention to the event, it even elicits additional microaggressions. So you're all probably saying, okay, what? Give me some examples. This is a taxonomy that he came up with. I'm not going to go through all this. I want to actually jump right to some examples. So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. I mean, I'm sure that you've all experienced this before. You know some of you experienced this before. When I'm talking about those Indians, I wasn't talking about you. Right? Or when I'm talking about those black folks, I'm not talking about you. Or whatever. When I'm talking about, you know, I mean, this. And again, the other thing about microaggressions, it can happen to any marginalized group in our society. So it's not just race. Women probably experience more microaggressions than anybody in our society, right? But the LGBT population experiences microaggressions. I mean, even people who have disabilities experience microaggressions, right? Because it basically has to do with, the discourse, the way that we talk about the different categories that we've created, right? There's a story about this that happened to my good friend and colleague Tammy Jolly Trotter, but I'm not going to go on. It happened at the nut lab, but that'll take up too much time. But it was basically this, you know, or you know, you're not like the rest of them. You're different. This is sort of another way that we sort of say this. They say, you know, you're getting an education. That's meant to be a compliment, right? When someone tells me that, okay, you know, well, that's pretty, you know, awesome, man. I'm so proud of you. You know, you're getting an education. You know, you're not like the rest of them. So think for a second, what do you mean by that? Because it's an underlying message, right? The underlying message is that Indians don't get an education. That's what sort of is meant to be a compliment on the surface, right? That, you know, wow, you're getting an education, that's awesome. Oh, if only there were more of them like you. Right? What do you mean by that? What they mean, really, is that Indians don't get an education. Indians spend their life on the res, you know, on welfare, or as drunks, or as alcoholics, or drug abusers. That's what that underlying message is sort of saying, right? They don't even realize that they're saying this. Or I don't think of you as Mexican. I think of you as a human being. This is the colorblind ideology, which has a purpose to sort of deny racism in a contemporary context, basically, so we don't have to talk about race. Therefore, we don't have to talk about disparities and the sort of difference in power. Or you speak such good English. This is often said to someone who's Latino or Asian because they're assumed to be a foreigner. It's interesting how this is how it plays itself out in the Indian context. Well, you don't have a res accent. Are you sure you're from the res?
Are you sure?
It's like every Indian is supposed to have a res accent. You know? If you want, I can talk that way, but when I go back to the res, actually, interesting enough, I started actually. Hey, Victor. You know, or how do black people feel about this? Or how do Indians feel about this? This is actually one that I did some studies on this a couple years back, and this is the most common microaggression that Native students experience in the education context. Whenever an Indian topic comes up, if you're only one or two of the Indians in the class, everybody looks to you and expects you to speak for all Indian people. White people never have to do this. Maybe rarely, very rarely, if you're the only white person sort of in a certain context or whatever, but very rarely do white people have to speak for all white people. But for some reason, people of color got to speak for all people of color. Indians got to speak for all Indians, and blacks got to speak for all blacks, and that kind of thing there, right? So those are some examples. Here's some interesting ones that sort of in a in a healthcare setting. This one here actually is very, very personal to me. My father died about 10 years ago, 11 years ago now almost, from complications from prostate cancer. And he was relatively young. I mean, he was like 80 or 81 when he died, but he was diagnosed with prostate cancer when he was like 71 or 72. And he should have actually outlived the cancer, right? I mean, prostate cancer actually occurs to a lot of people, you know, men when they get a certain age, and most of the time they outlive it anyway. They die from other things besides cancer, from the prostate cancer at least, right? But you know, after he got diagnosed with prostate cancer, I mean, you know, he was getting primarily his care was coming through IHS and White Earth and stuff, and there was this doctor, man. Every time my dad went to the doctor, he would come in and he would say this to him. How you doing today, Chief? how you feel today, Chief? You know, there's something sort of insidious about saying this to an old man who's suffering from cancer, standing there or sitting on the table with no clothes on, wearing his gown, and so on, right? And not feeling healthy and good about, you know, what's happening to him. And then for the doctor to come in and say this every time, how you feeling today, Chief? How you doing? So all Indian law, you know, you see what I'm saying here? I mean, it was just sort of just derogatory in a lot of different ways and on a bunch of different levels to be treated like this by someone who's supposed to be taking care of you, someone who's supposed to be helping you, and so on, right? This one here is another anecdotal one where Native people have told me this because it happened to them a lot of times. Well, you know, we have policies here and procedures we're supposed to follow here. The implication here, right, is that where you come from, you guys don't have policies, just do whatever. You see what I'm saying? That's what that's saying. When someone is treated that way. And of course, when race is involved with that, that's just sort of sending a message that, all of you people don't know, anything about what's happening and how we're supposed to do things here. Or, this one here, sometimes Native people bring, more than one family member to appointments for lots of different reasons, because sometimes we don't have childcare, sometimes, we're a little nervous, we're a little scared, things are happening, and the doctor comes in and says, whoa, looks like we're having a powwow today. Right? Or, again, this is in Red Lake. The implication, right, is that you guys don't know what you're doing up there in Red Lake, but here, this is how we do things, or whatever. This one here is not Native specific, but I gotta share this. This happened to my wife. My wife is Japanese, and this is when we first moved back to Bemidji from Alaska, and I wasn't there. I was at work, and she had to take our youngest in for a pediatric, checkup and get the shots or whatever. The doctor's just trying to make small talk, But he says this. So what do you do, Mom? Work at Super Buffet? My wife's Japanese. So apparently Asians living in Bemidji can only work at Super Buffet. So don't get me wrong. We're actually good friends with the people who own the Super Buffet over there. The family that owns the Super Buffet. We're actually really good friends with them. Some of our kids go to school together and stuff like that. And we go there and we visit with them. But so there's nothing wrong with sort of owning a Super Buffet or working at Super Buffet or anything like that. But sort of the context, or in terms of, come on, Doc. How is that supposed to be interpreted by the person? He could have just stopped right there, What do you do, Mom? Do you work outside the home? But the sort of, you see what I'm saying here, folks? So things like that, Thanksgiving's coming up here, right? These are actual advertisements from around the country where you can party like a pilgrim or drink like an Indian. Thanksgiving, come join us. All right? And then, Halloween and everything. This is not Halloween. This is again, this is Thanksgiving, but this is going to happen. Halloween, we're going to have this, and we're going to have this. People are going to be dressing up. Native people. These are microaggressions, sort of at the environmental level. The messages that they sort of send sort of go along with that, right? This was from last year. This was a Hooters down in Indiana. And then, of course, this was Victoria's Secret last year, right? There was a big ruckus about this, and they apologized and everything after that. But of course, we didn't mean it. We didn't intend, again, most of the time they're unintentional, right? This one here is a fashion, Paul Frank Industries fashion design. It's called Dream Catching. A powwow celebrating fashion a night out. Again, you got people dressing up like Indians. What's wrong with this picture here? Why would Native people be offended by this? This is GAP, National Advertisement Campaign, right? I'm sure Native people sort of see what's wrong with this here, right? right off the bat. But whites would say, well, what's wrong with this? That's what's wrong with this. Again, manifest destiny in terms of what that means to Native people, right? And how that sort of, basically affected. I mean, but it's all around us. It's advertisement, it's at environmental level, microaggressions, the environment, it's everywhere. I mean, in the butter that we buy, in the milk, in the dairy products, right? This was Echo. This is, Echo's a clothing line company. Their Weekend Warrior line, Subi honey, right? The idea of squaw bread. I mean, there was this. These are national sort of campaigns, right? Advertising companies and organizations. This happens at the the local level as well too. This was just last year, and it pissed me off when I woke up, in the morning and read my paper, and I opened up my paper. And I'm like, what is this? So this is Paul Bunyan. PB is Paul Bunyan Mall. So Paul Bunyan Mall did a Thanksgiving ad last year, and this is what the Thanksgiving ad looked like. Again, remember, Bemidji has 20% of the population is native in the Bemidji area. And they've got this, actually they're scared. It's like, what's going on here? You got this little kid, and this, obviously it's a Halloween costume. Bemidji, again, this is like right in my backyard, and I was like, oh. I'm like, come on, So I actually, first thing in the morning, I called up the manager of the Paul Bunyan Mall, and I said, I gotta ask you about this ad today. Why? What were you thinking? Do you realize that this is offensive to 20%, about 20% of your customer base? And then, of course, she was all apologetic. We're starting this, she said, well, we piloted, we did some research before we put this ad out. We had some high-level Indians tell us this was okay. I'm like, high-level Indians? Like, who the hell are those Indians? High-level Indians? I'm thinking, literally, that's what she told me. We had some high-level Indians look at this, and they said it was okay. And I'm like, well, who are those high-level Indians? She wouldn't tell me who they were, so I don't know. So the language that she was using, she was all apologetic, whatever. And she said, well, when we do some, next time we have some diversity training, we should, we'll have you come in and talk. I never heard back from her again about that, right? But there's all kinds of reasons why this is problematic, and the ones that I just showed you earlier in terms of why they're problematic. And I ended up writing a letter to the editor of the Pioneer, and it got published in there, and I sort of just walked through the different reasons why these things are problematic, right? The guy, obviously the kid wearing this inauthentic, thing, eagle feathers, other types of feathers, hawk feathers, owl feathers, whatever. They have sacred, significant meaning to Indian people. And when you put on these turkey feathers and chicken feathers and things like that and pose to be an Indian, you're disgracing us. You're disrespecting us when you do that, right? The other sort of level here in terms of why it's problematic is that it paints a picture that Indian people are only part of the past, right? When you put on costumes and things like that, you paint a picture and a perception that Indian people are only part of the past. It ignores our contemporary, modern day issues and what an Indian is or not. It distorts sort of reality, right? It allows Native or white people to dress up like Indians and play Indian. And it just sort of negates all of that history that I just got them talking about, of how we've been oppressed, of how millions of our ancestors have died as a result of that history. And it sort of just basically throws it out the door and says, who cares? So what? Why can't we, have Indian mascots? Why can't I dress up as an Indian? It wasn't I didn't do that to you. Again, that's true. Nobody alive today, is responsible or should feel guilty about what happened 100 years ago, but yet you got to have some responsibility for who you are today and what you do today, right? So there's other reasons. I'm not going to get into that. So there's some psychological dynamics and sort of things that are going on here in terms of why microaggressions are a big deal. Because this is another thing that people, non-natives, well, non-people of color often say, or people who are part of the majority of the dominant group often say is that what's the big deal? Microaggressions are, why don't you just get over it? Why are you being so sensitive? Why don't you just move on? That's a microaggression in and of itself right there when I say that, right? Because you're basically negating sort of my experience or whatever. But there's this clash of realities. And it has to do with, again, how we see history, right? For Native people and people of color and women and marginalized groups, they probably experience a microaggression a lot. Sometimes every day they experience them, sometimes multiple times a day, but certainly probably every week or so, right? But for people who are not marginalized, we see discrimination usually when it's very sort of overt, when it's very sort of obvious, sort of in your face. And those incidences are spread out over time. But for people of color and other people who are marginalized, those connections are very, very close to each other. So it's easy. So our reality about race, our reality about our marginalized group status is sort of in our face all the time. We have to think about it every single day when we wake up. We have to think about, is my race, is my gender, is my status, whatever group I belong to, is that going to have any effect on what happens to me today? But for people who are not marginalized, you rarely ever have to think about it. So that's why our realities are sort of very different from each other in how it affects us, right? And then of course these other ones here, right? Sort of unintentional bias, and it's invisible, and then again they always sort of deny it and say, well, I didn't mean that. That's not what I meant. You're making a big deal about this. The catch-22 of responding, right? Do I say something or I don't say something? This happens to me a lot, and this is where you sort of have to choose your battles wisely. I work over in the psych department over in Bemidji, right? And they're good, colleagues, good people. I believe that most people are decent people in the United States. I really do believe that's true. We're all taught the values of sort of treating everybody equal and treating everybody fairly and all that or whatever, right? But yeah, we have all these disparities, so how does that actually go together, which is a whole other talk. Just think about that for a second. I'm just gonna put this on you for a second, then I'll move on. But think about that for a second. Most people in the United States are good, decent people. We believe in equality. We believe in fairness. We believe in treating people, not discriminating against people. These are the values that every single one of us has been taught. But if that's true, then how come we're so unequal? How does that happen? How does that go together? We're all taught to be fair and treat everybody right, but we're not. That doesn't, right? So how does that happen? So, that's one of the sort of issues in terms of why this sort of occurs, right? So my colleagues are good, decent people, but yet they say shit sometimes. It's just like, really? But then I have to ask myself a bunch of questions right away. Did they just say what I thought they said? And do I say something or do I not say something? That's the catch-22. Because no matter what I do, it's going to have consequences. If I say something, it's going to affect the relationship between me and them. From that point on, if I don't say something, then I got to deal with that shit. And my wife's got to deal with it because I go home and I complain and cry about it. And she, it's like, but I got to sit there and stew over that, and that sucks up my energy, both physically, psychologically, right? And it causes me stress. Right, like the one, a couple of years ago, we were sitting around and they were talking about baseball, and they said, "Oh, those damn Indians, they beat the Twins today." I'm like, I'm sitting here with this on. It says no Redskins, right? This is what it says, right? And I'm thinking, so I got to think right away. I got to think, okay, what should I say here? Should I say something or should I not say something? And I kind of had it. I said, well, they're really Indians. Is what I said. And then got the hint right away, But I could have. But then I still kind of stewed over it anyway. I'm probably still stewing over it. I know. But this creates stress. Anybody in the healthcare profession here or whatever medical profession realizes that there's a whole area of research out there called stress research in terms of how stress affects the body, right? And And the idea now is that the daily stressors that people experience are actually much more detrimental than sort of significant life events are. Experiencing trauma, experiencing catastrophes and things like that there. I mean, yeah, they affect us, no doubt, but the daily stressors are the things that have the most impact on our health overall, psychologically, physically, spiritually, and so on, right? So these things have cumulative effects of microaggressions, and the microaggressions are an added stressor that people who belong to marginalized groups have to go through. And it takes its toll over time. And I could give, I know I'm kind of getting short on time, but I could give you a whole, well, I'm going to talk a little bit, but I got to give some examples. But it has biological, physical, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and spiritual effects. So what's the evidence? There was a meta-analytic review that was done just a few years ago by these folks here. They talk about it in terms of perceived discrimination, but that's basically, experiencing microaggressions, at least how you perceive those things or whatever, right? And they found that there were these pathways that existed between perceived discrimination, microaggressions, and the heightened stress response, health behaviors, and then ultimately, those are the ones that they tested or whatever, but they have indirect effects on mental and physical health, as well as the social support and, stigma identification, coping styles, and things like that there, right? So what they found is that the higher the perceived discrimination was, in general, just related to poor physical health in general. So in terms of, whether that you have cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, things like that, right? And of course, the higher the perceived discrimination, it was also significantly related to negative mental health. You were more likely to have depression, anxiety, other psychological mental health disorders. It also, you saw an increase in the multiple forms of stress response. This was both psychologically, but also physiologically in terms of increased cortisol levels, also in terms of ambulatory blood pressure, both actually during the day and nocturnal ambulatory, because our blood pressure is supposed to decrease in everybody when you go to sleep at night. It's supposed to just come down naturally. But for people who pursue more discrimination, experience more microaggressions, it doesn't go down like it's supposed to at night. So they're walking around with high blood pressure, and obviously you know what high blood pressure can do to any health condition that you have, right? It also related to decreases in healthy behaviors and increases in unhealthy behaviors. So when you're perceiving more discrimination, when you're experiencing more microaggressions, you are, you stop eating healthy, you stop, exercising, you start smoking more, you start using more alcohol, you probably start, eating things that you shouldn't be eating, and more of it, and stuff like that, right? So that, this was a very significant study. This is a study that was just done by it's actually ongoing right now by a good friend and colleague of mine, Melissa Walsh, who's at the med school over in Duluth. She's doing a study called the Meno-Giga study. She just presented this with me at a symposium in APA. And she's looking at diabetes, Native people who have diabetes. And within her interviews, she looked at microaggression experiences that they have. And she tried to, control for different sort of types of variables, things like age, gender, whether or not that they saw the doctor on or off the reservation. So this is when they go to the doctor, are they experiencing any microaggressions? So she had 6 items that asked about lifetime prevalence of microaggressions or microaggression experiences. And what she found, which is really, really interesting, it's the second, I know you can't see all these stats here, she did a basically a multiple regression analysis on this, right? And what she found is that right down here, it's the second to the last line right here, microaggression experiences were a significant predictor of depressive symptoms. So meaning the more microaggressions a person reported experiencing, the more likely they were to have depressive symptoms. She found that there was a significant predictor of hypoglycemia within the last 30 days. Right? Everybody here knows what hypoglycemia is, right? It has to do with blood sugar levels and diabetes and all that. It was not hyperglycemia, but hypoglycemia. Interestingly enough, it was actually almost the strongest predictor of whether that person had a heart attack in their life. So myocardial infractions is what the actual dependent variable was there. So people who had experienced more microaggressions when they go see the doctor were more likely to have a heart attack somewhere, right? So it's influencing their cardiovascular system. And then whether or not that they were hospitalized within the past year as well too. So, I mean, this is significant if you think about this for a second, particularly sort of in a health context. And diabetes as well, it's one of the leading killers of Native people, is diabetes. But think about diabetes itself in terms of the lifestyle change that you have to make and the care that you need. When you have diabetes, you need to take care of yourself, right? And when you have diabetes, you need to make sure that you're monitoring it. And you need to make sure that you're going to the doctor and you're doing follow-ups with your doctor and you're following your doctor's prescriptions. You're following your doctor's orders. But think about that for a second. If I go to the doctor and my doctor is committing microaggressions against me, I don't want to follow what that is telling me. You see what I'm saying? This happens at a very sort of interpersonal sort of level, at a micro level, probably even unconsciously. You see what I'm saying, guys? So this is sort of how these things sort of play themselves out interpersonally. If my doctor or my nurse or the staff person or the receptionist or whatever is not treating me well, first of all, why do I want to go back to that doctor? So you're going to miss appointments, which is not good when you have diabetes, right? And then you're not going to follow your doctor's care and instructions and things like that. So again, probably even unconsciously. So this is how literally racism kills. How racism hurts us, hurts people. Discrimination is killing us. Literally. It's having an effect on us in these sort of ways, right? So, I want to stop here for a second. If anybody has any thoughts, comments, questions. What do y'all think? Did I talk too fast? I kind of get worked up sometimes. I could talk about culturally appropriate care and stuff. We're kind of running short on time, but let me just say a couple of things about this. Again, this is sort of just one context in terms of here, in a health profession, for example, but it applies in terms of education, in terms of the criminal justice system. In all kinds of different sort of ways. We need to sort of, my point here is, one of my points, I guess, here is that, we just sort of need to think about how our society has shaped the way that we are. That's really sort of one of the major points. So we need to think about sort of how our past influences how things are happening today, and then how does that influence me as an individual in terms of how I interact with people, how I see the world, how I see my relationships with other people, and so on. Right? And in the health sort of context, if you're going to be providing culturally appropriate care or culturally appropriate education or whatever it is, again, it's important to sort of know sort of who you are, where you come from, what your background is, and how that has influenced sort of how your worldview, basically how you see the world, right? And then it's important to sort of understand the knowledge, the sort of value system, the beliefs, the attitudes, of that person that you're working with, that you're treating, or that you're, working with sort of on an interpersonal basis, how that influences how they see the world, and then how you're going to communicate with them, right? So you need to understand some different things, again, in a health setting here, right? Some explanatory models. We have different explanatory models. Basically, our worldviews about what it means to be healthy, what it means to be well. If you put it in an education context, Native people, I'll talk about this next week as well too, but Native people have a very, very different idea about what education means and how we are educated, right? And who's an educator and who's not an educator, right? So we have a very sort of different sort of worldview about what that means and what education means. And of course, we have a very, very dark sort of part of that as well, based on boarding school, era, right? In terms of education and how we think about education. So, so this is, and I bet you a lot of people who work with natives in education don't even realize that. When you sort of approach education from a certain model, from a certain worldview, again, with Native people in particular, you're continuing to oppress us. If you only come at it from a Western worldview about education and what that means to be educated and where knowledge comes from. Here I'm talking about epistemologies and things like that, right, in terms of Native ways of knowing versus Western science ways of knowing and things like like that there, right? So that sort of plays into out, in terms of values. And then of course it's communication styles, how we communicate with each other, right? And so on. So I'll leave that there. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yes.
Is there a flip side to the low graduation rates where, okay, kids aren't graduating from high school, but are they learning their culture? Are they more culturally grounded? You know, on the other side of it where, yeah, we can look at that part, and that's the Western view. Look, look, you didn't graduate from high school.
Yeah.
They have grandparents who never graduated from high school, but you will never go to their grandparent who speaks the language, who runs the ceremonies and say, you're a failure because you never went to high school, you never finished high school.
Right.
Is there a flip side to that?
Well, I think that there probably is in some situations and some circumstances where, where the person sort of was educated in other ways, kind of what I was talking about. I mean, maybe that person didn't graduate from high school or whatever, but yet, they're still sort of considered, a respected person in the community because they sort of know the cultural values and sort of native ways sort of process there. So I'm sure that plays itself out, and that probably is sort of a positive flip side of that, or whatever, right? But I think that for the most part, that's probably not happening, at least based on what I see on my reservation, at least, right? Where you have a lot of young people who are not sort of being educated in our culture, or, so to speak, or whatever, right? So, yeah. Yes.
I would like to share this information with my doctor. Do you give presentations to med school students?
I would love to.
Study that they could pick up and bring with?
I could probably provide some references and things like that. There are different studies that have been done out there, but I mean, I'd be happy to come speak with med students. I'm here for the next 2 weeks, so if we can arrange something over there, I'll be happy to. I've got other stuff that's specifically health related as well too, in terms of physical health related, so I can kind of talk.
When you first started, I thought, how is he going to tie to diabetes? But it sure makes sense.
Yeah, and that's at the interpersonal level, but again, we still have all these macro sort of level sort of things happening in terms of, food deserts, and I mean, other people could probably speak a little bit more to that than I could. I mean, Prairie, Rose, so there's other people who can sort of speak to those kinds of things, but it's sort of a combination of these macro level things and these micro level, but these macro level things, here's the other thing about this, again, like I said, I think that most people are good, decent people who believe in fairness, believe in equality, but yet they go around doing all kinds of shit to people, hurting people, and don't even realize that they're doing it, right? I mean, some people sort of, there are some people out there who believe that they're not biased or, that kind of thing, right? But I mean, I don't believe that, because every single one of us has biases. Everybody does. I'm no different than anybody else. I mean, I have biases. We all do. Anybody born and raised in the United States or North America, regardless of your racial background, you have biases, because it's almost like if they're only simple, we inherit this. We inherit this sort of ideology. We inherit this discourse. We inherit sort of the what it means to be, who you are, and we love to identify people and put them into categories. And and we have beliefs about that. I mean, I'm no different. I have biases. Because I grew up here, right? I have to catch myself. But someone who comes and tells me, I'm not racist. What do you mean? I don't have any biases. I just don't trust that person. That person to me is more dangerous than those crazy folks over there in Lee, North Dakota, right? Those neo-Nazi over there, they're crazy, and and we should worry about them, right? But I know where that person is coming from. I know what that person believes. But the person in front of me who says that they don't have any biases, can't trust this person, because obviously they're not in touch with sort of their own reality in terms of who they are and where they come from. And that person can go around engaging in microaggressions all the time and don't even realize, that what they're doing or what they're saying and that kind of stuff. So it always starts with ourselves. We have to sort of know who we are and where we come from and what our biases are, and sort of keep those things in check, right? I mean, I almost do it all the time. I have to catch myself, you know what I mean? You know, if I'm unconsciously, you know, I have to, you know, do these things. I have to recognize my privilege. I'm a man. I have privilege that goes along with being a man. I'm a PhD now. I have privilege that goes along with being a PhD and what that means, right? And the other thing too is that I can pass, right? People will identify me as sometimes, you know, I mean, I can pass as being white as well too. If you don't know my last name, someone look at me, they might think that I'm white or, you know, Greek. I mean, someone thought I was Greek. I don't know where I come from. Hair going on there, whatever. French gonna come out there. Stuff, you know. Or Arab. Someone thought I was Arab once before as well too. Middle Eastern. You know, so I have. You know, I mean, and that again, that speaks to our sort of society. I mean, there's privilege that goes along with that. If I can be identified by somebody else as not native, they're going to treat me differently, right? So I have to recognize that, and well, what I do is I end up using that to benefit my people in some ways. Right? So, I mean, that's why I got my PhD in the first place, right? So I can give back and do something. Thanks. I'll try to give Jackie some references about some specific health related stuff for med students or doctors or whatever. Other questions, comments? Yes.
As a person born privileged white male, I want to say that when I look back in my history and dealing with my racist attitudes and stuff, I am very grateful to people who were patient and kind with me and educated me and took the time to educate me in a non-shaming way about pointing out my racist attitudes and things that I've heard a lot. So as you were talking about that, do I say something to my colleagues? Do I make a comment? I also get your stress. Remember that, but also as a person who is white and male and has that privilege, I'm very grateful for people who have been kind for, especially, you know, since my 20s, to just say, you know, this is why what you just said was idiotic.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to make that comment, just because for me it's been invaluable, and I'm a better person for it, and it also helped me see, you know, oh, okay.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, that also speaks to, you know, the other side of that as well too, where, I mean, you know, we're human, you know, we're gonna make mistakes. You know, people are gonna make mistakes. You know, people who belong to a privileged group are gonna make mistakes, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you know, it's good that you had, you know, it's fortunate that you had sort of, you know, patient and good friends and colleagues that were sort of there to sort of, you know, recognize that and say, you know, look, you know, what you said, you know, and this, and then, you know, you were able to sort of think about that, and, you know, a lot of it sort of changes behavior. Right? So, because again, a lot of it is sort of unconscious, sort of,
Exactly.
we don't even realize, you know, and again, it's unintentional for the most part, you know, and that's the insidious part about it, so it's sort of hitting you, and you don't realize we're doing this. Questions? Any questions? Thanks a lot.